Welcome to our series from John Sheehy for the Petaluma History Room at the Petaluma Regional Library. We are hosting John's presentation entitled Petaluma's Women Pioneers. This talk was originally given to the Petaluma Women's Club in July of 2025. John received the Petaluma Good Egg Award in 2019. He and his photographer Scott Hess wrote the book On a River Winding Home, Stories and Visions of the Petaluma River Watershed, which was awarded the Gay LeBaron Editors Award in 2019 from the Sonoma County Historical Association. But as a fourth-generation Petaluma native, John grew up with these stories of his family, as well as those whose lives shaped the Petaluma landscape. In fact, he and his wife live on Sonoma Mountain, not too far from where his great-grandfather settled in 1863. Thank you for sharing these stories, John. We look forward to this presentation.
Thank you, Connie. I'm going to begin this evening with a story about a woman named Clara Steele. In 1856, Clara set out for Petaluma from the East Coast by ship with her two children and in-laws. Waiting for them on the docks was Clara's husband and his cousin. The two men had come to California the year before, seeking to strike it rich in the goldfields. Unsuccessful, they made their way to Petaluma, where, like many disappointed miners, they returned to what they knew, growing crops on a small farm they rented in Two Rock. One thing Clara happened to notice while in San Francisco was the high prices people were willing to pay for hard cheese, even though it arrived on ships from the East Coast, often moldy and rancid. When she got to the Steele's farm in Two Rock, Clara hired a local vaquero, or cowboy, to rope a few of the wild longhorn cows grazing nearby and milk them. Using a recipe from her English grandmother's cookbook, she made up a batch of cheddar cheese and then took it down to San Francisco to present to the city's cheesemongers. They went crazy for it, offering her top dollar. Now, back in Two Rock, the Steeles acquired a number of milk cows imported from the East Coast and launched California's first commercial creamery. Other farmers soon followed suit, and within 5 years, the coastal prairie from Petaluma to the Point Reyes Peninsula had become the cow heaven of California. The Steeles dominated the market, eventually expanding their dairy empire to encompass 63,000 acres along the central Pacific coast. Sadly, they named their business Steele Brothers and Company, sidelining the legacy of their entrepreneurial founder, Clara Steele. Which brings me to the focus of my talk this evening: lore versus history. When I was a boy, my great uncle Will Casey used to take me on walks around Petaluma, filling my head with local history. Born on the family dairy ranch in Lakeville in 1878, Uncle Will was a grocer, a card shark, a bootlegger, and a ladies' man back in his day, and one of Petaluma's main storytellers in his retirement. He held court in the former speakeasy at the back of Opie's Grocery. His stories were always fun and entertaining, but once I grew older and started researching Petaluma history, I learned they weren't necessarily all that factual, which, to be honest, is the main attraction of lore. As Mark Twain famously proclaimed, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. Now, I've got nothing against lore. It fills a vital need in providing a community like Petaluma with a set of memorable stories that help to define its identity. But lore has its downsides when it obscures or sidelines history that doesn't conform to its storyline. And that leaves gaps in the historical record, which in turn hinders our ability to look to the past as a means of better understanding what is occurring today in the present. Filling in those gaps is part of what motivates me as a self-declared history detective. As Hilary Mantel, the author of Wolf Hall, points out, historians search for history in the same way you sift through landfill for evidence of what people want to bury. In that spirit, this evening, I'm going to dig up some stories of Petaluma's early women pioneers, who have either been buried or lost to time. Let's first begin by dispelling some of the classic Petaluma lore clouding their legacy. Legend has it the town was established by a group of rugged pioneers who came west seeking gold. Nonconformists, escaping bad marriages, society, or the law back east, they arrived looking to live wild and free of civilized culture. As one local historian put it, Petaluma wasn't a place for women for a long, long time, with the exception of girls working the saloons. Now, in fact, most of the gold diggers were middle class men who, after striking out in the gold fields, decided to stay in California. Many either sent for their wives and children to make the journey west by ship, as was the case with Clara Steele, or else sailed back home to collect them. Others returned home to marry their hometown sweethearts and bring them out to California. Still, others came to California with their wives and children via wagon trains across the prairie. Now, it is true that at the height of the gold rush in 1849 and 1850, the former Miwok village of Petaluma became a camp of meat hunters supplying wild game to San Francisco. But that began to change in 1852 when a failed gold miner named George Keller made an illegal claim to 40 acres of a Mexican land grant along the Petaluma River. He then he hired a surveyor named Brewster to lay out the initial town of Petaluma, seen here on the map in green, and commenced the selling off property lots. One of the first to buy in was a 30-year-old woman named Hannah Hathaway. Hannah sailed from Maine to California in the fall of 1851 with her parents and brothers, all of who died of cholera after crossing the Isthmus of Panama, a common affliction at the time. Hannah continued on with the surviving members of another family on the voyage, the Douglases, to Petaluma. There, with the help of Robert Douglas Jr., she built Petaluma's first boarding house at the corner of Washington and Kentucky Streets, where the Bank of America parking lot sits today. It was rustic, but boarders were more than happy to pay 50 cents a night to sleep on the floor beneath a warm blanket. Soon after, Robert Douglas hired a contractor to build the American Hotel on Main Street, where Putnam Plaza sits today. In December 1852, Robert and Hannah held Petaluma's first wedding, after which Hannah became a partner in running the hotel. By that time, the town had become Sonoma County's main shipping port, thanks to the area's first agricultural boom in potatoes. Petaluma included 50 homes, 2 hotels, a potato warehouse, and a general store called Kent and Smith's. The store was operated by Walter and Cassie Kent, along with a partner named Smith, and was located on Main Street, across from today's Putnam Plaza, where the Steiger Building, which was built in 1856, still stands. Like many early mom and pop stores, Cassie worked the back room, keeping the books and dealing with inventory and suppliers, while Walter worked the front of the store, stocking shelves and dealing with customers. By 1854, there were an estimated 400 people living in Petaluma. That's when the potato boom went bust due to overproduction and soil exhaustion, sending Petaluma's economy into a lull. It would not rebound until the start of the California wheat boom a few years later. Now, during that lull, the Kent's general store went belly up and was sold at public auction to pay off creditors. The Kents also owned a 160-acre farm south of town. To shield the farm from creditors, 26-year-old Cassie legally filed as what was known as a sole trader, claiming that she alone was the farm's owner in charge of raising stock and poultry. The Sole Trader Act was passed by the California legislature in 1852 and enabled a woman burdened with a desolate or absentee husband, a common occurrence given California's boom and bust cycles at the time, to legally own and operate her own business, independent of her husband. Legislators also allowed married women to retain any assets they brought to a marriage and made it easier for them to seek a divorce. The other major development impacting California women in the 1850s was safer sex. Thanks to Charles Goodyear's recent invention of vulcanized rubber, sales of condoms and womb veil diaphragms were soaring in the 1850s, along with an array of female medicines for birth control available from pharmacies, dry goods stores, and mail order catalogs. As California's fertility rates began to plummet in the 1850s and divorce cases began to rise, 70% of the plaintiffs being women, a number of women took the opportunity to become sole traders. Now, sadly, bankrupt husbands soon found a loophole in the Sole Trader Act, which allowed them to protect their assets from creditors by transferring them to their wives, as was the case with Walter and Cassie Kent and their farm. Before that loophole was closed in 1862, I counted at least a dozen Petaluma women who filed as fraudulent sole traders, claiming to be wheelwrights, blacksmiths, ranchers, saloon keepers, and lumber dealers. Which is not to say that women were incapable of such professions at the time, but the telltale sign of a fraudulent filing was that a woman designated her husband as her working agent or business manager. A number of Petaluma women, however, made good use of the Sole Trader Act to establish their own businesses. Among them was Cassie Kent. After saving the family farm, she divorced her husband, remarried, and filed as a sole trader of the Central Hotel, which was located at the corner of Kentucky Street and Western Avenue, then known as English Street, a site occupied today by the Chase Bank. Some of you may know that that hotel was later known as the City Hotel and then the Continental Hotel before it burned down in 1967, which was an event I witnessed as a child with my Uncle Will. Now, Cassie was not the first woman, however, to run a Petaluma hotel on her own. That honor belongs to an Irish woman named Rosanna Loftus, who in 1853 opened the Farmers Hotel at the corner of Main Street and Western Avenue, where the Masonic Lodge stands today. After 5 years, she sold the hotel to a German merchant who renamed it the Union Hotel Gasthaus, as shown in this illustration. In 1857, Petaluma's first official census counted 1,338 residents, 38% of whom were women. Now, that created opportunities for women to open local businesses that catered specifically to other women. In 1857, three women, Mary Ann Trevor, Susan Coles, and Hannah Davis, all filed as sole traders to open their own millinery and dress shops in town. By the 1870s, with Petaluma's population having grown to more than 3,000, the city had a dozen millineries and dress shops operated by women. There were also women-owned hair salons, bakeries, and restaurants, including the Farmers Restaurant, operated by Sarah Wiley and Fanny Ellsworth. It was located in the Hinshaw Building, which still stands today near the corner of Petaluma Boulevard and Washington Street, where the new Napoli restaurant just opened. By the dawning of the Progressive Era in the 1890s, women in Petaluma were operating houseware stores, art supply shops, music schools, medical practices, ice cream stands, and even horse-drawn taxi services. And then there was the field of education. Prior to the 1850s, school teachers were predominantly men. That changed with the Industrial Revolution, which drew educated men away to better paying jobs. Women filled the vacancies, drawn in part by the independence and sense of purpose teaching provided. By the turn of the 20th century, nearly 75% of America's teachers were women. They, of course, faced a double standard, as expressed by some of the strict rules imposed upon them, including that younger women were prohibited from marrying during the term of their contracts, as marriage normally led to pregnancy, and pregnancy would mean not being able to finish their school term. Accordingly, they were also prohibited from keeping company with men and loitering at hot spots for singles, such as ice cream shops. Public education in Petaluma began in 1858 when the town incorporated as a city, allowing citizens to be taxed for things like schools. Prior to that, children attended private schools. In 1859, the city opened its first public grammar school, known as the Brick School, at B and Fifth Streets. The man appointed principal departed after the first semester due to a salary dispute. He was replaced by Abigail Goodwin Haskell, who ran the school through most of the 1860s. Abigail and her husband Barnabas came to Petaluma from New England with their young son William in 1857. Barnabas opened a dry goods store on Main Street, while Abigail taught at a private school before being appointed principal of the Brick School. Reformers, the Haskells brought with them some progressive initiatives, including advocacy for temperance, abolition of slavery, children's rights, and female emancipation. Wrote Abigail, "Woman was not created to be the slave of man. She was to be his equal, to walk upright by his side in her native dignity and purity." For Abigail, that included the right to free love, which before the hippies co-opted the term in the 1960s, was a rallying cry against marriage as a transactional affair, traditionally arranged between families with little room for love or even individual consent. Free lovers like Abigail believed that everyone should have the ability to choose a monogamous partner based solely on love and to end that relationship once the love did. The Haskells were also members of the Swedenborgian Church, a Christian denomination inspired by the 18th century Swedish philosopher and mystic Emanuel Swedenborg. Swedenborg believed in the immortality of the soul after death, claiming to have conversed daily with spirits and angels. Those claims gave rise in the 1850s to a countercultural movement known as spiritualism, or communicating with the dead. It began when two teenage girls in upstate New York, Maggie and Kate Fox, claimed to have heard rappings from the dead. Joined by their older sister Leah, they began staging public performances as trance mediums, communicating with souls of the deceased, setting off a new national sensation. Now, despite its questionable legitimacy, spiritualism filled a void left by traditional religion at the time, which placed death at the periphery. At a time when one child in every three died before the age of 10, and when many women did not survive childbirth rather, spiritualism provided a sense of solace and closure to many struggling with grief. That included the Haskells, whose oldest child died when she was 8 years old. Spiritualism was also the only religious sect at the time to recognize the equality of women. Now, as such, it produced the first large group of women to address large public gatherings. In California, many of those women became early leaders in the women's suffrage movement, including Abigail Haskell. In 1869, Abigail called a meeting at her home to launch the Sonoma County Women's Suffrage Association, along with two fellow local spiritualists, Sarah Myers Latimer and Lucretia Hatch. A few weeks later, the three women traveled together to San Francisco to attend the first convention of the California Women's Suffrage Association. At the convention, Abigail was elected the association's first president, and Latimer one of her vice presidents. The group's first order of business was organizing a petition drive for a state referendum granting women the vote. 2 months later, Abigail led a female delegation to Sacramento to address a select committee of the state legislature, the first women in California history to do so. She presented the committee with the suffrage petition signed by more than 3,000 supporters, both men and women. The referendum was then put to a vote in the state assembly, where it was overwhelmingly defeated. California women would not be granted the vote until 1911. Over the next decade, the suffrage movement faced increased opposition. In 1873, Congress passed the Comstock Act, making it illegal to mail or distribute materials related to contraception or sex education. By 1880, abortion had been outlawed in most states. In 1877, the Petaluma Courier reported that women's suffrage in America is on the decline, and justly so. It has been agitated by a bad lot of harem-scarum women who have mixed free love, spiritualism, and all sorts of women's rights into a sort of political and social hodgepodge that has disgusted right-thinking people. Despite such headwinds, Abigail continued to press on. A big part of her quest was securing equal access to higher education for women, which she herself had been denied as a young woman back east. During her presentation at the state capitol in 1870, Abigail asked legislatures to open the new state university in Berkeley to women. 6 months later, they did so. Abigail's last big initiative was launching a Sonoma Marin chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1879 as its founding president. That was at a time when the union, founded 5 years earlier, was led by Frances Willard, another educator, who focused on a broader range of moral reforms than just banning alcohol, including raising the age of consent, an 8-hour workday, and suffrage for women. Abigail died 5 years later in 1884. I'm going to close my talk by focusing on two other pioneering women in Petaluma during the 1890s. Now, the first is Angela Canepa, a well-to-do widow who became a prominent Petaluma developer. An immigrant from Genoa, Italy, Angela came to Petaluma in 1880 from Calaveras County, where she had recently married Giovanni Canepa, also from Genoa. The couple operated a grocery in the Carpenter Building at the northeast corner of Washington and Kentucky Streets, where the Bank of America parking lot sits today. Now, old timers may remember the Carpenter Building used to house Gilardi's Tavern up until it was torn down in the 1960s for the Bank of America building. In 1891, the Canepas built a beautiful Italianate-style house on Kentucky Street across from today's Penry Park, as seen here in yellow today. As with many merchant couples, Angela served as a silent partner in the grocery until Giovanni's death in 1898. 6 months later, she sold the grocery and at the age of 45 became a local developer, purchasing an old livery stable across from the grocery on the southwest corner of Washington and Kentucky Streets. There, she built a stunning new Victorian commercial building, which was immediately recognized as one of the finest structures in Northern California. She rented the upstairs offices to physicians and dentists, and the bottom floor to her longtime grocery clerk, Luigi Solari, and his wife Amelia, who turned it into the Golden West Grocery. Angela then ventured into residential development, subdividing a corner lot at Petaluma Boulevard North and Cherry Street, where she built 6 new homes, a number of which are still standing today. In 1907, she built a new commercial building at the corner of Washington and Keller Streets and had the Solaris move their grocery there. They operated the grocery until 1925 when they sold it to a widow named Giovanna Volpe, whose descendants continue to operate it today as Volpe's Restaurant. Angela then leased the Solari's old space in the Canepa building at the corner of Kentucky and Washington Streets to the Young Herald Company. A few years after Angela's death in 1917, her family sold the Canepa building to the druggist Harry Herald, who promptly renamed it the Herald Building. And you'll see above the upstairs entrance, he installed his name in a plaque, his name in the year 1899, which was when Angela constructed the building, sadly erasing her legacy from the site. Finally, there is Rena Shattuck, Petaluma's first woman newspaper editor and publisher. In 1876, Rena's older brother William launched the Petaluma Courier newspaper along with a lawyer named Edward Lippett. A few years later, he hired 23-year-old Rena to write the newspaper's society column. Observant, entertaining, and heartfelt, she did so under the pen name Polly Larkin. With the dawning of the progressive era in the 1890s, women journalists, frustrated with being restricted to writing about society, gardening, food, and fashion, began agitating for the right to report on subjects considered the domain of male reporters. Led by a crusading journalist named Nellie Bly, another pen name, they proved to editors that news and features written from a feminine perspective had market value, i.e., they sold newspapers. Among them was Rena Shattuck, who in 1895 launched her own newspaper, the Petalumian, with the subtitle Polly Larkin's Weekly Newspaper, committing to featuring no scandals, bitterness, nor sensationalism. In 1896, inspired by a new national City Beautiful movement, Rena called a meeting of women at her newspaper offices to form the Ladies Improvement Club. With a local widowed socialite, Addie Atwater, serving as president and Rena as founding vice president, the club members positioned their entry into Petaluma's male-dominated political arena as municipal housekeepers, working to clean up the city and improve its health and well-being. Their initial focus was on cleaning up Petaluma's two parks at the time, Hill Park, now known as Henry Park, and Walnut Park, which both were littered then with garbage, overgrown with weeds, trampled upon by livestock, and unsafe for any woman or child who dared to enter them. Denied funding by the city council, they raised their own money through fundraising events. After re-landscaping the parks, they continued to undertake other beautification efforts throughout Petaluma over the next decade, and also inspired the launch of other ladies improvement clubs throughout the Bay Area. Rena, meanwhile, sold the Petalumian after a couple of years and moved to San Francisco, where she started a community newspaper. She returned to Petaluma in 1901 to serve as editor of a special Thanksgiving edition of the Petaluma Argus, written entirely by members of the Ladies Improvement Club. Soon afterwards, she became a writer for the Associated Press and one of California's better known women journalists. And finally, I'd like to close with a nod to my great grandmother, Julia Moriarty Casey, a formidable woman, as you can see from her photos, who was the matriarch of our family. Having lost her parents at a young age, she immigrated from Ireland at the age of 14 with her aunt to San Francisco, where she went to work as a domestic for a wealthy merchant family there before marrying an Irishman who was farming in Lakeville named John Casey. The story is they met at a St. Patty's Day dance. Her husband's death at age 48 from a bad case of the measles left her a widow with 6 children. She continued to operate the farm for another 10 years. The oldest boys were old enough to milk the cows. But finally, she sold the farm at the turn of the century and moved into town, building 2 homes on Bassett Street, one of which she sold to the Sheehy family, who ran a painting shop in town, and whose oldest son eventually married her youngest daughter. And I had the privilege of growing up in one of the houses that Julia built there. And so with that, I conclude my presentation this evening. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. For more stories from John, check out his blog at petalumahistorian.com. And if you enjoyed today's journey into Petaluma's colorful past and it has you curious for more information, swing by the Regional Library and explore the Petaluma History Room. It's a treasure trove waiting to be discovered. You can find more information on our website at sonomalibrary.org, including our blog called Not Just Chickens, Free Range History from the Petaluma History Room. So until next time, take care and have a good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Connie.